Good evening and welcome to our September All Books Considered Book Club meeting. Hope everybody had a great summer. It's been a while. I'm your host, Bill Nemitz, and this evening we are thrilled to be joined by author Ryan Britt, who is the author of our September book selection, Phasers on Stun, which, by the way, has the coolest cover of a book that I think we've done this year. But there we go, right there. Before we get started, as usual, I just want to give a shout out to Bull Moose and Coffee by Design for their generous support of the club. Without organizations like these, events like this just wouldn't happen. So thank you to both. I'd also like to recognize our bookstore partners, in addition to Bull Moose, where many of you secured your copy of the book, and they include Book Stacks in Bucksport, None Such Books and More in South Portland, Mockingbird Bookshop in Bath, Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, DDG Booksellers in Farmington, Left Bank Books in Belfast, and Print in Portland. Now, at book club events, we do give away a few author-signed copies of each book, and congrats to these book club members for scoring a copy of Phasers on Stun. They include Walden, Paul from Winthrop, Gretchen from Winthrop, and Ben from Lyman. You're all going to get a book signed by Ryan. If you have a question during our conversation tonight, you can send it over to us at fun@mainepublic.org, and I'll try to work it into the discussion. If you're going to do that, do it soon, because we already have quite a few questions from readers who want to connect with Ryan. So let's get started. Ryan, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Oh, it's great to have you. I'm a child of the 50s. You are a child of the 80s. I turned, I think, 12 when the original series came out. So I think I was a prime target for this series, and I remember it well. I remember how we were all I had watched Twilight Zone, I had watched The Outer Limits, so we were dabbled in that stuff, but we were just blown away by this new series, and we're all walking around in the schoolyard, doing this and everything. So tell me, how does somebody who was born, I think it was 1981, you were born?
Yeah.
How does someone who's born in 1981 find himself, as far as I can tell, the quintessential expert on all things Star Wars, Star Trek? How did that happen?
Well, it was my family. My father and my mother were both really into Star Trek before I was born. By the time I was 6, I had already seen some of the original series, and I already had favorites, and I already loved Spock. And then by the time I was turning 7, The Next Generation was debuting, which, of course, had LeVar Burton in it, who was huge on Reading Rainbow. And so I had already loved Reading Rainbow. And so that was huge to me. And so my mom said, "Oh, we'll try the new Star Trek." And my dad was like, "I don't know about the bald guy." And even as a kid, I was a little like, "I don't know about The Next Generation." But, those things combined. And in my family, Star Trek was kind of like going to church. It was just done. It wasn't, there was no choice, really. And it's something that just stayed with me and became part of my professional life.
And it has been right on through your adulthood. I mean, you continue to essentially report on this now with each new iteration. It's amazing to me as I read the book how connected you are, and how, or maybe how many connections you have. We want you to read a little bit from the book in a minute, but before I ask that, when Ryan Britt calls and you're in any way connected with Star Trek, present, past, whatever, I mean, do they call you back in 5 minutes?
Not always. Usually it's the reverse. It's that someone will call me and say, "Can you do this in 5 minutes?"
Okay.
And if you can't, then we'll go to the next name on the list. But I think that my name is near at the top of one of those lists, but that was gradual. You know what I mean? That's just John Hodgman says this in one of his memoirs, is that a lot of this business of being in entertainment or writing about entertainment is just the willingness to say yes, and say yes on short notice. So some of my Star Trek access began because I was just willing to be quick. Somebody was like, "Oh, Rainn Wilson is going to be on the new Star Trek, and we have one day for you to watch the episode and interview him today. Can you do it? And I said, sure. And then that you do that enough times, and then you become somebody who's known for being able to do that.
You're reliable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, before we start, because one of the things early in the book that just blew me away was, there are basically two figures in the original series that if I were going to be interviewing them, I'd be quaking. And of course, they're Leonard Nimoy and Bill Shatner. And you write about your interview with Shatner. Just tell us a little bit about that, because I know I could feel your nervousness as you wrote about.
Well, I can read from it if you'd like.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
So that we'll spoil what's going to happen in here, but this is from the beginning of the book, the prologue, very beginning of the book. On a cold afternoon in February 2018, I looked out at the New York City skyline from my apartment in Queens as I held my sleeping 9-month-old daughter on my shoulder. I had to adjust her just right, worried I was going to wake her up. In about 20 minutes, my wife would be back from work, but the subway was delayed, and this important phone call was going to happen before that. If my baby woke up during the interview, the person at the other end would just have to deal with it. My phone vibrated, and as I answered the call, I wished I still had a flip phone. The voice at the other end of the phone was that of Captain Kirk. "This is Mr. Shatner," the voice said. Reflexively, because I'd watched Star Trek since I was 6 years old, I began calling him Sir immediately. I was interviewing William Shatner briefly for an article, mostly because of some voiceover work he'd done in a children's film called Aliens Ate My Homework. Weirdly, this movie was based on a series of children's chapter books that I'd read in grade school. Around the same time, I'd become obsessed with Trek. As a journalist, I'd interviewed famous people before, but Shatner was different. He was the captain. I was nervous, and my sleeping baby had started to squirm. I launched into my first question. I asked Shatner about his unique cadence, that famous, halting, Captain Kirk thing he does so well. People who have some characteristic way of speaking, to my knowledge, don't assume it. It's just there, and slowly they become aware of the fact that when they talk in a pattern that is uniquely theirs. In fact, even now, I have to turn to my wife and say, "Is he imitating me?" This struck me as both totally honest and bizarrely out of touch with reality. I laughed nervously. Shatner pretending like he doesn't know how he talks is like if Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said, "I've never noticed I'm tall." Shatner and I talked a little bit about the science of plants and whether we'll ever be able to communicate with flowers directly. Around this time, my daughter woke up and started crying loudly. "That is the cry of hunger," William Shatner said, suddenly, the authority on my entire life. "You must feed her now." Yeah, no kidding, Kirk. Thanks for the tip. Although I obviously was recording the call, I don't actually remember the rest of the phone call that well. I have Shatner's words in mind, but what I was doing with my baby while trying to talk to Captain Kirk is less clear. I do know that as I struggled with a bottle, Shatner continued to give me orders, becoming an on-the-spot parenting coach over the phone. Time began to blur, and I think for a moment I was caught between dimensions, kind of like Kirk was in the Tholian web. On the one hand, I was on the phone with my childhood. On the other hand, I was holding my child. And I'll stop there.
Oh, that's wonderful. I find myself wanting to slip into Scotty's voice with the bottle and saying, "I'm giving it all I can, Captain."
Yeah.
That's great. Let's talk about the original series first, because I think broadly, that's probably the one, at least in my generation, a lot of people are most familiar with. The theme that is persistent throughout your writing about it and throughout the whole series was that these were not just, we talked about the Twilight Zone and these other shows that were science fiction, but they were, as you, in our earlier conversations, they were anthologies. It was different every week. Whereas Star Trek, I'm going to get shot for that, was it was this recurring cast of characters, and it was more often than not a morality play. I mean, there was a really strong message coming through indirectly through the diversity of the cast, but also directly in terms of the storyline. And I think that's, as kids, what attracted us to this show. Prior to that, as you write, we had Westerns, and that was where you learn the difference between good and bad, right and wrong. Star Trek revolutionized that. Talk a little bit about how that came to be with Gene Roddenberry, the people who put the show together, and whether it was accidental or whether this was their deep purpose in creating this show to teach society a lesson.
Well, I think one thing I wanted to say to you, something really smart you just said, is about how you picked up on it as kids, right? As even though it was this show that was aimed for adults and for an adult audience, that kids could pick up on the morality tales. I've noticed that my 6-year-old, who's seen a fair amount of the original series and the 1973 animated series now, she will often be able to kind of guess the moral twist in some of the episodes. Oh, this giant alien cloud will end up being good, even though it seems like it's menacing or something like that. And that's so often the case, right, in Star Trek episodes where, Arena, the famous moment where Kirk refuses to kill the Gorn. No, I won't kill him, right? The whole episode is this hilarious fight with, struggling with the Gorn and the rocks and the makeshift, gun that he makes, out of sulfur. But then he's like, no, I won't do it. And that is just really unique for action adventure.
Right.
In general, not just then, but now, so finding that in general on television is very rare in action adventure. But what Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, set out to do, he had worked in Westerns, specifically the show Have Gun Will Travel, which if you watch is wonderful because, and I write about this in the book, and, I spend a lot of time in the original series in the book more than any of the other shows for a reason. Is that it's also morality tales, and Paladin is this gunslinger, but he's really, really ethical. And so he's kind of a proto version of Kirk, Spock, and Bones kind of wrapped up in one character. But Roddenberry wanted to make an action adventure show that wasn't a Western set in space. And he wanted it to be for grown-ups, not like Lost in Space was for kind of kids and her family show, or Doctor Who was kind of an educational show for families, and not an anthology show. He wanted recurring characters. So that alone is revolutionary. Before we get into the ethical and moral aspects of Star Trek, just the idea of recurring characters on a science fiction show for grown-ups, that was already huge. So every science fiction TV show comes from that after that point. In terms of the evolution of the conscious, the social sort of responsibility that Star Trek gained, some of that was gradual, right? Like some of that happened as the show went on. And a lot of that comes from Roddenberry, but a lot of it also comes from Gene L. Kuhn, the other Gene of Star Trek, who was the script editor for kind of half the series. He came in kind of midway through season 1. And he's what we would call a showrunner now. But Gene Kuhn is the guy who wrote Devil in the Dark and made it where the Horta was just protecting its babies. And he came up with the prime directive, we can't interfere, and things like that. But there was a variety of writers. There was a huge variety of writers writing for the original series. And many of them were writers of prose science fiction. Many of them had written books and novels that were in the science fiction field. George Clayton Johnson, who wrote the first aired episode ever, is co-author of the novel Logan's Run. Theodore Sturgeon, who wrote Amok Time, was this massive science fiction novelist. The guy who wrote the Doomsday Machine was a big science fiction novelist. So there was a lot of talent there that was from the literary world, and that's another reason why Star Trek felt so sophisticated, is because it was.
And I get the sense that these people were actually vying to write an episode. I mean, it wasn't sometimes you have to go out and find writers, but in this case, it struck me as a situation where it was considered, despite the fact that it was science fiction, despite the fact that it was television, became kind of a literary badge of honor to have written one of these episodes.
Well, and smartly, Gene Roddenberry recruited some of them. There was a wonderful man named Norman Spinrad who wrote The Doomsday Machine, and he was a novelist and a critic. And Roddenberry recruited him, and he had never written a teleplay before. So that's interesting. Yeah, and that's
how do you do a teleplay?
How do you do a right? He had to ask his friend Harlan Ellison. And I talked to him. He's in his later years, I talked to him over the phone at length for the book, and he was wonderful. But, a lot of those writers aren't around anymore. I was lucky to interview some of them before they passed, and some, like Norman, are still alive. But in some ways, it was an intelligent decision on Roddenberry to say, let's actually let's get the book people. I always like to say that Phasers on Stun is a book that contains other books, because there's so many writers of books that wrote for not just the original series, but the subsequent shows and films too. Nicholas Meyer is an accomplished novelist before he directs The Wrath of Khan. Michael Chabon, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist that everyone is aware of, was responsible for some of the newer iterations of Star Trek. And so, that's an amazing amount of literary talent that you don't see in other media franchises.
Right.
It's just like you don't have a lot of Pulitzer Prize winners writing for Marvel, but you do in Star Trek.
Right. Yeah, I remember shows like Bonanza. It was like you're watching the same show every week.
Yeah, right.
Never changed. Hey,
Yeah.
I'm going to go to a reader question because, as I said, we've got a ton of them, and
Let's do it.
need to pay attention. We got a series of questions from Michael in Lewiston, and his first question goes right to the issue you were just describing about. Well, it goes right to the title of the book. He says, Walter Koenig, who plays Chekhov in the original series, is the one who urged you to keep the title of the book as Phasers on Stun, because it meant you do not have to kill anyone. I'm fascinated by that because, as you said, so many other shows were blow them up, shoot them up, all those things, and you'd have these fake deaths, but they were still violent deaths on TV. But Michael wants to know what other titles you considered, if any, for the book.
Oh, many. I think that the original title, I believe, was Spock Lives, because
Right.
I really liked the idea of making the book. In writing about the original series, it was hard to write about it holistically, so I started with Spock, and people will notice that in the beginning of the first chapter is called Spock Stole His Own Brain, because I felt that without Spock, there was no Star Trek. So Spock
Right.
Lives was one of the titles. Spock Rocks was one of the titles. Star Trek Lives was one of the titles, but that was also the title of a nonfiction work from the 70s that was written by fans, and I kind of wanted to honor that. Yeah, I think that we had like a Boldly Go, which I wasn't like crazy about, but I liked Phasers on Stun because it captured that kind of pulpy silliness. But it also captures the that which is part of why Star Trek is fun too, because it's kind of zany and hyperbolic. But it also was, like, that's the thing, like that there, you've got the Vulcan neck pinch, you've got Phasers on Stun, you've got the let's try not to have the conflict, let's try to find another way. And so and then when I was talking to Walter Koenig, it was not long after the January 6th stuff that had happened in real life, and he wanted to talk a lot to me about how important it was for people to have outlets and how important it was for people to see peace and peaceful depictions of things. And I told him the title, and he's like, no, I think that's great, because I was not sure if it was too silly.
Yeah. Plus with the cover is kind of zany too, so
Well, yeah, and I write about this in the 4th chapter a lot. Is I think that people are always like, "Oh, Star Trek's very serious." I was like, "Yes, but it's also really fun. And if it wasn't really fun, then it wouldn't be so successful at being serious."
Exactly. Michael, also speaking of the Spock versus Kirk thing, he writes that you mentioned a few times in the beginning how difficult it was for other actors to work with William Shatner. And from where he sits, it seems that Shatner really isn't focused as much as Leonard Nimoy. Why? Where's the center of gravity here between these two people? Because they're obviously very different, but they're also, one can't exist without the other. So
Yeah.
Well,
Leonard Nimoy's first memoir was called I Am Not Spock. And of course, he later had one that was called I Am Spock. But William Shatner is Captain Kirk, right? Whereas like Leonard Nimoy is not necessarily Mr. Spock. And I know that there's quotes in the book where people were saying, oh, he really was Spock, and that Nimoy was kind of going being a method actor a bit when he was doing the original series and the films. But, the character of Spock is closer to like an even more repressed Sherlock Holmes, and so it's very difficult to play that role, and to really play it to the hilt. And And whereas William Shatner gets to embody and use his humanity, if you will, in all his exuberance in every moment of Kirk. Whereas, Nimoy didn't. So I think that Nimoy had a harder job. But I think that, as I write in the book, Shatner also nailed the character immediately, whereas Nimoy developed Spock. The early episodes, he's not as Spocky as we might think of him, whereas Shatner, you watch Where No Man Has Gone Before in 1965, it is right out of the gate. It's the same performance all the way to the end, to Turnabout Intruder, all the way to Star Trek Generations, in fact. It's
you even see it in some of the
performance.
You even see it in some of the TV commercials that he does now.
Absolutely. And when you talk to him, and I've interviewed him more recently than the phone call in 2018. I talked to him right after he went to space, which is at the end of the book. And you talk to him on Zoom like we're talking now, and he's just like, hello. And you're like, that's Kirk. Okay. Get serious. So he still is that.
Well, okay, so I think it's no secret that you really like Spock. I mean, Spock is your guy.
Who doesn't? Spock's great.
So one question we got from a listener was, we understand your affinity for Spock. What character or characters did you dislike the most? And I guess this would cover the whole span. And why? Who were your least favorites?
I don't know. I mean, I think that there's some, like, I didn't like Neelix on Star Trek Voyager, but I was also just defending the honor of the actor Ethan Phillips, who played him, because he's a wonderful actor. I suppose when I was a kid, I loved all of the original series cast as a kid, because it was like they were like my family members, so I couldn't not like them. I didn't really understand Wesley on The Next Generation initially, I suppose, because he was supposed to be an audience surrogate for me, but it didn't really work for me. But subsequently, I've watched some Wesley episodes with my daughter, and I actually was like, this is actually great. Yeah, I don't know. I think that the Star Trek characters are so diverse that even if you find something you don't like in them, with the villains, right, you're not supposed to like the villains in many cases, and particularly when you're a kid. I hated, like, the Klingon from Star Trek 3 played by Christopher Lloyd, because he was so horrible, and he takes out Kirk's son, and he's holding Spock hostage, and he also had the voice of Doc Brown, which made me very uncomfortable, because I was like, why is Doc Brown being so horrible? Why is Kirk having
you wonder when is Michael J. Fox going to walk onto the set,
Yeah, but I think that, in the Next Generation, they would bring on characters that were designed to challenge you, like Ensign Ro, Michelle Forbes' wonderful character, and she would kind of be in your face, and then you'd be like, oh, I don't like her. And then by the end of the show, you're like, oh, she's great. So I think that Star Trek will do that to you, right? They'll show you a character that you think you're not going to like, and then so that's my answer. But I never really loved Neelix, but I find something to love in most Star Trek characters.
Well, let me flip that around. If you had a chance to play one of them, which one would you play?
I don't know. That's a great question. I suppose I would want to play like Riker's cousin, like Will Riker's friend. I don't know if Jonathan Frakes used to live in Maine, and he's a wonderful guy. I've interviewed him probably over 10 times. He played Riker on The Next Generation, and he is just a wonderful, exuberant guy. So I guess I would want to be like one of Riker's relatives, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I already slipped a couple of times and said Star Wars instead of Star Trek, but one reader wants to know, does your love of science fiction cross the great cultural divide and include the Star Wars franchise? Or are we talking oil and water here?
No, of course I love Star Wars, just for different reasons. I love a lot of science fiction. I have a book about Dune coming out next week called The Spice Must Flow, which talks about Star Wars a lot and Star Trek a bit. But no, I love Star Wars. I was just literally fighting with lightsabers with my daughter in our house, like, before I came to record this. So I love Star Wars, and I think that it does something different. You know what I mean? Star Wars is very much a fairy tale, and the aesthetics of Star Wars are very fun and interesting and very noticeable. And, George Lucas has said, and this is in my book, that, Star Wars doesn't exist without Star Trek coming first, that Star Wars stood on the shoulders, because not that they're similar at all, but that the idea of doing a really mainstream science fiction adventure is something that Star Trek did first. That's what people forget. They're like, Star Trek's really geeky, and it's like, no. Like, hardcore science fiction novels from the 50s are really geeky. Star Trek was really mainstream. Yeah. And Star Wars, was a hit right away, whereas Star Trek was a slow burn. But no, Star Wars is great. I revisit the original films a lot, And I actually have recently just started thinking about how great the 1977 film is and how it's almost like it's underrated because there's been so much Star Wars since then, in the same way that the 60s Star Trek just continues to be great to watch as like a scholar and a journalist. The 77 Star Wars is really wonderful. And yeah, I have a kid, and so it's helping me remind myself of why all of this stuff is really fun.
Yeah, what's so appealing about the whole thing. Let's talk a little bit about the Trekkie phenomenon, because I was struck by the fact that it really wasn't until the original series was canceled that this phenomenon took hold, with these, what began as these really modest little conventions, maybe a few hundred people in New York City, and has grown into, a worldwide community now. How did that happen? Why, when the original series went off the air, why do you think it didn't just go the way of other series that came and went, and in its aftermath instead spawned this following that is as fervent and as widespread today as ever?
Well, this is not, for people that are huge experts, this revelation, this is in my book, but it's not a revelation from my book, is that the reason why Star Trek survived and became a phenomenon in the early 70s was because it was syndicated. Is because the original series in its entirety was suddenly playing 5 days a week as a rerun show on syndicated channels the same year it went off the air. Right. So 1969, it goes off the air in the middle of the year. And the same year, there's tons of local stations who have bought a syndication deal through Kaiser Broadcasting and some other folks. And then suddenly the show is running 5 days a week in syndicated markets. And so suddenly there was some people that would thought of Star Trek as a 70s show because they only saw it in the early 70s. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that the fans were unique, and that, I talk about Joan Winston in the book, who was somebody who actually worked in TV publicity, but not for NBC. And she just decided to organize these conventions in New York City. So you needed to have not just people that were hardcore nerds, right? But you needed to have people that were organized and had connections.
Right.
And so that's really interesting to me, like figures like that, where she's like, we're going to get all these people at this hotel in New York. And, you say they were small, but the whole thing about the New York conventions was that they were all much bigger than anybody expected.
Right.
There was about 3,000 people at the first one.
They were outperforming the more
Comic-Con.
traditional science fiction conventions, correct?
That's right. By thousands, you know what I mean? And by the time you get to 1974, and they've got like the fourth of these first big conventions, you've got 20,000 people. Right. That's the population of South Portland. You know what I mean? Going to a convention center to see Roddenberry, DeForest Kelley, Bones, George Takei, Sulu, that's a lot of people that are coming. And at the time, San Diego Comic-Con in 1970 was about 1,000 people. So that puts it in perspective. It never happened before.
And these actors were doing this for nothing.
At first. Yeah.
I couldn't believe that. You pay for my hotel room, you buy my meals, and I'll come. I mean, that just struck me as so unheard of today, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing you think about this, I write about this in the book, is that some of these actors were in their 40s and 50s, and they were suddenly rock stars. Jimmy Doohan, who played Scotty, was in his 50s. DeForest Kelley, who played Bones, was in his late 50s. And they were suddenly bigger than, they felt like the Beatles. And their show had been off the air for 4 years, 5 years. So I think that's really fascinating. Like, what a fascinating thing, I got to talk to some of the people that were there, like Deborah Langsam, who made the first Star Trek fanzine. So talking to some of the people that are still alive who were there is really cool. And I was lucky to be able to get a hold of those folks.
How did that work? I mean, today, if you were going to organize a fan following, I mean, you look at the tools that we have at our disposal, social media, all the social media platforms, and it's not hard if you push the right button to get 10,000 people to show up in one place, simply by using your smartphone. But as I read about the early conventions, I was thinking, you write about the fanzines, and I know they were very popular. Was that pretty much the sole mechanism for bringing people together?
It was the sole way that they were communicated, but in terms of the promotion, again, Joan Winston, who had wrote a memoir that was called Making the Trek Conventions, which was an invaluable resource for me. She's no longer with us, sadly. She's wonderful. She worked in TV publicity. So she knew how to do mass mailings, right, to people. She knew how to get ads placed in publications that would attract a lot of people. So you had somebody who was, in essence, an amateur who was secretly a professional. She was using her professional know-how to do an amateur convention, right? And that was how, but Roddenberry was also, when there was the letter writing campaigns to save Star Trek, he was also really good at that. And he tapped into people like B. Joe Trimble, who had been a big science fiction fan person, and she knew about letter writing campaigns. Like, how do you get a bunch of letters out to people? How do you make that happen? So that they had people that were kind of like, that was their thing. And some of them were borrowed.
The early social influencers, in other words.
But yeah, and like B. Joe Trimble is still alive, right? Like, she still goes to Star Trek conventions. Like, she's credited as the woman who saved Star Trek, right? Because it was going to get canceled in the second season, and then there was a big letter writing campaign, and those people just knew how to do letter writing campaigns, and they knew it from working in print science fiction as well.
Yeah, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the we know who the regulars were. Of course, they're iconic, but I was absolutely struck when I started seeing all the guest stars on Star Trek, and I put together this quick list of people who have appeared on Star Trek, and they include Mick Fleetwood Mac, Sarah Silverman, the comedian, Jason Alexander from Seinfeld, Christian Slater, Kelsey Grammer, and Kirstie Alley, both from Cheers and later from Frasier. King Abdullah II from Jordan, Dwayne Washington, The Rock, Stephen Hawking, who's not an actor,
Yeah,
John Larroquette. The list goes on and on and on. And these people were we talked earlier about the writers. Were these people recruited? How many? Very often we're seeing them on Star Trek before Seinfeld, before Frasier, before the various shows that made them famous. But it's an amazing collection of actors who then went on to make names for themselves. Were the people who made Star Trek just that good at identifying really good talent for guest stars?
Well, it depends, because you get into different eras there. You know what I mean? Because Kirstie Alley is unique because that was her first film. She was not a known actor at all. She was from Topeka, Kansas. She auditioned, and obviously she's no longer with us kind of recently, very sadly, but she had suffered this massive family tragedy where her parents had been in a car accident right when she was auditioning for The Wrath of Khan. And then Nicholas Meyer, the director of The Wrath of Khan, who was like 36, he was really young himself, was like, oh, well, we're going to wait for her because she's really great. So that was Kirstie Alley's career exists because of The Wrath of Khan. So that's an instance of that's the beginning of her career. Someone like Mick Fleetwood, they usually ask. The famous story is that, the most famous one that people forget is Whoopi Goldberg, because she was a recurring character on The Next Generation, starting with season 2. And that was at her request. People thought that she wasn't serious. She had to convince LeVar Burton. He's like, would you tell them that I'm serious, that I want to be on the show? That's literally happened. I remember talking to Brent Spiner several times about this, who played Data on The Next Generation and has played a bunch of other roles on other Star Treks. He was like, we had Whoopi Goldberg, who was one of the biggest comedians in the world, one of the biggest stars in the world, wanted to be on our show. So in many cases, Jason Alexander is a good example. He wanted to be on Voyager. I think that The Rock being on Voyager is just one of those things. He wasn't the Rock. Sarah Silverman was a big Star Trek fan. Kelsey Grammer definitely asked to be on in that small cameo he has in The Next Generation. But yeah, in other cases, I think it's sort of like a fluke. Like Tom Hardy is in Star Trek Nemesis. Why was Tom Hardy in Star Trek Nemesis? Well, because Tom Hardy is a great actor, but it was before he was really, famous. I think in some cases, it is like some of the acting talent. I mean, Patrick Stewart was not a famous actor before he was in Dune, and he was a Shakespeare
now
guy.
Everybody knows,
and then after he did The Next Generation, he said, well, now I know what it's like to be Sting. He couldn't believe what it was like to be that famous. So yeah, I think that some of it is just that, you look at the acting, someone like even like Gates McFadden, who played Dr. Crusher on The Next Generation. She was a choreographer for Jim Henson, right?
Hmm.
Like she's a very talented person. But she's known as Dr. Crusher. So in some cases you have people that are maybe not even being utilized.
Yeah.
Kim Cattrall was in Star Trek 6 before Sex and the City. What an amazing range she has.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got a question from Ted from Saco, and he wants to know, was there any famous person that you interviewed who played a Star Trek cameo role who didn't really want to be directly connected with the show? Not saying embarrassed, but just maybe not that forthcoming. Like, I'm thinking, maybe somebody, a Shakespearean actor who thought that, going on to television was beneath him or her, or was it
like, well, I think you're referencing how Patrick Stewart felt about Star Trek at the beginning. I've been blessed with talking to Sir Patrick a couple times. And once was a very lengthy interview that was after the book was done, which was last year. Yeah, I mean, he admits fully that he was kind of snobby when he first got the role on The Next Generation of Jean-Luc Picard, and that he didn't really want to be there, but that he lightened up once he realized how important it was. But to answer the listener's question, I would say no. All the people that I've talked to wanted to talk about Star Trek. If I
Okay.
if I didn't talk to somebody, it was because they didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And there's a few who maybe don't want to talk about Star Trek. I think that Tom Hardy's one of them. I just mentioned him.
Yeah.
I've never been able to interview him and talk to him about Star Trek. But I mean, for the most part, I've found that some of these people I cold called. Robin Curtis, who played Saavik in Star Trek 3 and 4, she lives in upstate New York. She was awesome. I just cold called her, and she was just like, yeah, let's talk about Star Trek. Love to.
You mentioned Jason Alexander. You told me earlier that you interviewed him recently.
Yeah.
Which I would kill. I would kill to interview Jason.
Well, he did some guest spots on Voyager as an alien in Star Trek Voyager in the 90s, but more recently he was a voice on the children's Star Trek show, Star Trek Prodigy, which was produced by Nickelodeon. And so he had a voice. I was like, and you wouldn't even know it was him. So I just emailed his publicist. Said, look, I'd like to talk to Jason Alexander. This is for a parenting publication I work for called Fatherly. And I was like, I'd love to talk to Jason Alexander about Star Trek and this show. And they were like, sure. And he was just, I mean, he's the smartest, coolest guy there is. But the funny thing about Jason Alexander is that he based his entire, I said, how influenced was your acting career by Star Trek? He's like, no, you don't understand. My acting career exists because of Captain Kirk. When I was doing auditions, when I was in college, Jason Alexander said, I was just doing Captain Kirk impressions. And he's like, the problem is I didn't even know I was doing it, but he's hardcore. I mean, I love, if people are Seinfeld fans, there's a moment in an episode called The Foundation where George does the Khan scream, Khan! But they do it in a way where they rotated the camera around him and he's yelling up. It's not like how it is in the film at all, but it feels like it feels more accurate, even though it's not. That's how great of a Shatner impression he does.
Well, speaking of Seinfeld, here's a good one. You mentioned, we talk about the show, we talk about Jason Alexander as George. That begs the question: where would Kramer have found a place in Star Trek? Where, if you had to put Kramer in any the whole span, where would you put him?
Like a malfunctioning hologram, like one of those like malfunctioning like holograms would come on and be like, hey, like something like that, I guess.
Yeah, I think he would. He'd probably steal the show. I expect. Let's talk a little bit. I was going to say 30,000 feet, but maybe it's 30,000 miles. One of the parts of the whole narrative that really captivated me was the direct influence that Star Trek had on NASA. And I'm going to let you take it from there, because that was just, that was science fiction intersecting with science in a very real way and in a very human way. So tell us about that. How
Yeah.
sure, I always mispronounce her name.
Uhura. Yeah, Uhura. It's all right.
Right.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
please throw in an S there. How that came about. And I mean, that changed the world. That really did. It changed
Yeah.
than just audience.
The more famous thing is, that the first space shuttle was named Enterprise because Star Trek fans wrote in to NASA, and Gerald Ford said, okay,
Right.
we can name the first space shuttle NASA, or name the first NASA space shuttle Enterprise. And the cast, minus Shatner, oddly, the entire original cast and Gene Roddenberry went to the rollout, and there it was, and the band played the original series.
And it never flew.
But it was intended to.
Right,
which is interesting. It was they basically changed the way that the shuttles were engineered, and that's why, which is something I found in researching this book, which I hadn't known. But then Nichelle Nichols, was starting to become friends with these people at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at NASA, and doing these talks about the importance of space exploration and creating the future that Star Trek espoused, which was diversity and representation. And suddenly she was like, wait a minute, like if I have to have another meeting with another white guy and see a bunch of white astronauts, I think the quote is lily white astronauts, then I'm not going to see the future that I am asking for. So she had already started a nonprofit called Women in Motion, which was a nonprofit set up to help women who wanted to go into business, right, for themselves, and whatever that business was. So she decided to use that entrepreneurial spirit and say, look, I'm going to work with NASA to directly recruit women and people of color into the space shuttle program. And she said that if she would help, she would do recruitment videos for them, she would train, and she told them, she basically threatened is, and if I don't people of color and women in the space program, then I'm going to sue you, because they were like, well, they are just not applying. And she's like, they're not applying because they think that they're not wanted.
Right.
They think that people don't want them. So that leads to, the first Black astronauts, and it leads to the first women in the space program, period. That recruitment program, started by Nichelle Nichols, created that. We don't have Sally Ride without Nichelle Nichols, period. Yeah. And the most interesting, and a lot of this comes from a great documentary called Woman in Motion. And I interviewed the director of that documentary around the time I was doing the book. And people had known famously that Martin Luther King Jr. had been a Star Trek fan and had asked.
I was just going to mention that, yeah.
Yeah, and had asked Nichelle Nichols to stay on Star Trek when she considered leaving. But yeah, her impact, because she was a character on a science fiction show and then she changed the course of spaceflight history, it just felt really just an underreported thing. And it blows my mind to think about, the fact that she also did the flight simulators, right? Yeah. Like she could, of all the Star Trek actors, Lieutenant Uhura is the only one who could actually land a space shuttle. Like if necessary, she could have, because she trained in the flight simulators. She trained with NASA. So you can find all these wonderful videos from the 70s of her doing recruitment videos for NASA. But I think that somewhere in the 80s, after, and a lot of the people that perished on Challenger were her astronauts. And, she talks about that in this documentary about how heartbreaking that was for her. Yeah. And that is, and then Star Trek 4 was dedicated to the memory of those astronauts. But I think by the time we got to the 90s, the narrative that Nichelle Nichols had made all of those, Mae Jemison, who was one of the first, one of the more famous Black female astronauts, was directly inspired by Nichelle Nichols, not just from Star Trek, but from Nichelle Nichols' work at NASA.
Her work politically, yeah.
At NASA, just from a recruitment. I mean, she literally worked for them as a recruiter.
Right. It's unbelievable. Gina from Harpswell asks, who or what was behind the strange interactions of Uhura and Spock?
Yeah, early on, in the Man Trap and Charlie X, Uhura is singing to Spock. I think we have to blame Gene Roddenberry for that one, is that he wanted to have a little flirtation there. But they had different writers too. Charlie X, I don't remember who the writer is off the top of my head, but I know that the Man Trap was written by George Clayton Johnson, and I think that he wanted to have a little flirtation on the bridge.
Let's talk a little bit more about that part of Spock, because he's human, he's not human, he's half human. I get the sense that, as you said earlier, Leonard Nimoy really created that role more than any writer.
Yes,
And
that's true.
it came to what I find ironic is that in many ways it came to define him as Leonard Nimoy. You know, in other words, he was one of those types of people who would be. I mean, he's a great actor, you know, and did many other things, but he would be forever identified, starting with that character and starting with the $600 rubber ears. You know that.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, the
yeah.
high tech makeup department there. And how do you think the role of Spock changed Leonard Nimoy?
Yeah, I mean, people do not lead with "he's the guy who directed Three Men and a Baby," even though that
Right.
is true. um, and that's a great film,
Yeah.
great Leonard Nimoy film. Yeah, I think like many of the Star Trek actors, it was a burden and a blessing, right?
Mhm.
And I think that I've interviewed Adam, his son, a few times, who did a wonderful documentary called "For the Love of Spock," and I would say
Mhm.
that Adam answers that question beautifully in that documentary. So it's on Netflix. I would watch it. It's wonderful. I can't encapsulate all of that into my book, but I would say that it changed him in that it made him want to take control of his art in every way. Nimoy is the
Mhm.
first Star Trek actor who directs Star Trek films. He's the first Star Trek actor who wants to start writing them. And so then that changes the franchise, but it changes his involvement with it, um, which I think is really interesting because that meant that he was able to then say things with a character that perhaps he couldn't have said
Mhm.
otherwise.
And back to William Shatner. I'm just one reader wanted to know what your reaction was when he actually made it into space.
I think I was really touched. You know what I mean? Like I remember watching it on my phone, sitting on my steps in South Portland in my home, just like being outside and just kind of watching the footage live and just not really believing it.
Yeah.
Um, you know, because I had seen Shatner at a convention in Phoenix when I was a kid with my dad, you know,
Mhm.
around the time Star Trek Generations came out and, you know, Kirk was dying. You know, so
Yeah.
I have a lot of feelings about Captain Kirk. I think that I was very moved, but it was also very surreal. It was very
Mhm.
strange. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it was very strange because again, like imagine like just like Nichelle Nichols doing recruitment for NASA. I think the joke I made to you is it's like, what if Jeff Goldblum became a dinosaur wrangler in real life? You know, like that's like what it's like. You know what I mean? It's so
Uh,
strange.
yeah.
You know,
Well, it's like George
yeah.
Costanza used to say, "Worlds colliding, worlds
Worlds
colliding."
colliding, worlds colliding. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think that that's the level it's on. It's like if it's kind of like when like Harrison Ford and he rescues people in his helicopter. You're like, wait a
Yeah.
minute, that's pretty on the nose. You know, you know. So I think that would be like
Yeah.
that. You know,
You think somebody scripted it? We
yeah.
have time, I guess, just for one more question, but that's a good one. From reader, a listener wants to know: do you think Trek franchises will continue to roll out over time? Does this go on forever?
I think so. You know, I was going to say we were talking about Spock earlier. Is that the contemporary Spock is Ethan Peck, who plays Spock on the shows Star Trek: Strange New Worlds, which is just finished its second season. And Ethan Peck is the grandson of Gregory Peck, the great actor. And Ethan Peck is fantastic Spock. And I've talked to Ethan like 4, 5, 6 times, and he is awesome. And part of the
Mhm.
reason why he's awesome is because he gets that we have to see the crack in the Spock mask in order to love Spock.
Ah,
So when
okay.
Spock freaks, you know, one of the most popular Spock episodes, the ones where he loses it, right? Like Amok Time, right? He loses his mind. So Ethan Peck, I think, embodies that and is a contemporary actor who knows how to do a contemporary show. So if you watch Strange New Worlds, got Anson Mount as Captain Pike and Paul Wesley, who's a wonderful actor who's playing a younger James T. Kirk. They've got Celia Rose Gooding playing a younger Uhura. They just introduced a new Scotty, who's very funny, impish and hilarious. So right there, you've got it. But then, you know, the same year you had Patrick Stewart, Jonathan Frakes, and the whole Next Generation cast back in the 3rd season of Picard, swinging from the fences and just a wonderful, emotional, brilliant send off for those wonderful actors who are also like all in their 70s, by the way. Like,
Yeah.
you know, these like wonderful shows where you can have the leads be over 60. and have it be the best thing you've ever seen. So I would say, if you don't think that Star Trek's not doing well, I would watch Star Trek Picard season 3 and Strange New World seasons 1 and 2 and get back to me, because your minds will be blown by how good they are and how fun they are and how funny they are. I mean, Strange New Worlds just did a musical. They did the first ever Star Trek musical. And it's the kind of thing they would have done in the original series had they had the money. You know, they're caught in an energy field that's making them sing. Why? And it's great. And like, my daughter has seen it, and we love the songs, and Spock's singing is great. And it's just, they keep doing new things with it, and they keep being able to make it relevant, but also make it cool. So yeah, I'm a huge supporter of the newer shows, and that's in the final chapters of my book. And the people that are making them, you know, Akiva Goldsman, who's one of the showrunners of Strange New Worlds, you know, he's from your generation. You know, he was watching Star Trek in '66 when he was 10 years old, and he's like, that's what I want to do with my life. You know, so yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, my final question then is, I wonder what your reaction would be if the call came sometime that they wanted you to wanted you to appear in a Star Trek presentation.
I'd rather write it.
If they gave you your choice, what would you be? Would you be a crew member? Would you be an alien?
Yeah, you want to be in the uniform, ideally.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you want to be in the uniform, ideally. I don't know. I always kind of thought that it would be, you know, I think that everybody has had this answer. You'd always kind of want to be the one where it was sort of like, Captain, look over here, and they get it zapped or something like that. I think that would be great. You know. Like,
hey, we'll keep our fingers crossed, right?
I'd rather write an episode. That's my dream.
That would be cool. Yeah,
I'm a writer. That's what I'd rather do.
There you go. There you go. Hey, I can't believe the 50 minutes has gone by. I mean, we could talk about this all night, but and that's the beauty of this whole your work and the subject of your work is it just spans so many decades and so much of our lives. So I just want to thank you for doing this and wish you luck as you go forward. It's an amazingly in-depth piece of work, and from journalist to journalist, I was just blown away at your ability to really get beneath the surface of this thing and show what made all these shows tick. So great job, and thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
That's so kind, Bill. Thank you so much. I love it, and I hope everybody enjoyed listening.
We did. I just want to give another shout out to our sponsors, Bull Moose and Coffee by Design, again for your support in this series. And looking ahead, our October book club selection is It Goes. This is all periods. This is like Captain Kirk talking. It Goes So Fast. The Year of No Do-Overs by Mary Louise Kelly. And if that name sounds familiar, you might recognize Mary Louise as the co-host of All Things Considered on NPR. She's going to join us for a book club event on Thursday, October 12th. So we hope you can join us then. Get that book, start reading. Brian, again, thank you. It's been a pleasure meeting and talking to you. And I am Bill Nemitz, and I hope all you have a great evening. Thanks for joining us.